Hello and welcome to week 11 problem solving session. The session usually happens on Saturday, but due to unforeseeable circumstances, we are conducting the session on Sunday, 7th April 2024. So, welcome to week 11 problem solving session for the NPTEL course on environmental impact assessment. This course is being taken by Dr. Harshit Soshan Lakra, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning, Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. I am Isha Rathore, PMRF and Research Scholar at Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. So, a few housekeeping rules before we begin the session. Please mute yourself for the session. If you have any questions or want to post answers to the questions, which we look forward in the session, you can put them in the chat box. At different points, I will ask you if you have any queries. You can then raise your hand or unmute yourself for asking these questions. So the outline of the session is that we are first going to look up at the highlights from each of the week. So we're going to look up at the key takeaways from each of the lecture units which were discussed in week 11. Then we will look up at assignment questions. So these are questions from the previous run of the same course. So that is in 2023. And we are going to look up at solutions to these assignment questions with their explanation. We will look up at them for practice. And lastly, we received any queries from you regarding this week's content in the discussion forums. We will also clarify those as well as the queries that you have based on this session. Okay, so let's move on. So week 11, we looked up at implementation and follow-up of the EIA state. So highlights from week 11. So lecture 51 was the first lecture which we discussed in this week. So we looked up at EIA methods for land acquisition, resettlement, and livelihoods. So we have been looking up at AIA methods for each of the different environmental parameters and how we are going to put them in the report and how we go about assessing them. So first is scoping and initial planning. So the questions we need to ask here is what is the extent of land acquisition and resettlement? What is the cost of compensation and mitigation measures? Whether this project is feasible or not. That is doing the land acquisition and resettlement instead of choosing another site and building the same project. And stakeholders' views about the project, whether they are satisfied with the compensation and with the acquisition process, as well as the resettlement action plan. So their views also needs to be incorporated. Then the things that we need to do in scoping is to establish a multidisciplinary team with experts in handling people as well as have stakeholders involved in the discussions. We need to review the project design. We need to review the existing primary and secondary socioeconomic data based on the community which is being displaced or whose land is being acquired. And we need to benchmark other projects, use them as benchmarks to see what can be done and what and we need to develop project maps and look up at the zone of project influence. So to determine the zone of project influence, we have two zones. We have the primary zone and the secondary zone. So the primary zone is the zone of direct impact. So these are areas where the project activities and facilities are located, including access routes, water and power supply networks, supply chains, and employee accommodation. So this is your zone of direct impact. All the things which are going to be directly impacted because of your land acquisition or resettlement procedures. That zone is your primary zone. Then your secondary zone is this larger region in which the project is located that will encounter the main economic impacts from the project, including the influx of economic migrants as well as employment and business opportunities. So, because of the construction forces which are going to labor forces which are going to come up in your area, the sort of economic impacts from this project or any sort of uh, physical impact from the project outside the direct zone of direct impact is your secondary zone. So for doing the profiling and baseline data collection, we have the social impact assessment. We need to do the social impact assessment because a community is being socially involved, which will be displaced or whose land is being acquired. So we need to generate a social profile describing the affected communities, and we need to look up at the likely concerns about the resettlements that they will have. So the critical purpose of comprehensive baseline is to look up at the environmental and social impacts. So we need to look up at both environmental as well as social impacts. We need to look up at risks and opportunities, determine the eligibility for compensation and resettlement housing for the affected community, monitoring the implementation of the resettlement action plan or RAP, and the preparation of environmental and social management plans. So for data collection, we can use For desk-based data collection, we have the census data. You can also undergo or undertake socioeconomic baseline survey, where you go and survey the socioeconomic conditions of each of the uh, households located in the affected community. You need to collect additional data on household access to social service, including healthcare, water, education, and skills training. Also, you need to collect information about livelihood activities, including the employment, agriculture, trading, services, and natural resources, and how this community go about their financial uh, needs. So, all of this data needs to be collected. For data collection, the measures which can be undertaken are, because you have restricted access to data, and a huge amount of data is going to be generated. So there can also be a risk of fraud and misuse if this data falls into wrong hands. And because sometimes the surveyors would not understand the questions and how to ask them to people because of language issues or something. So they might give wrong answers, or that data might be exaggerated to get more out of the compensation. So you need to analyze this data, and you should have experienced data collectors or surveyors. You should also be careful about the access, that is, who has access to all of this data which was collected, because this data, if it falls into a wrong hand, it can lead to misuse of this data. You also need to, when doing the data collection for land acquisition resettlement, you need to meet the national, regional, international legal requirements, if any are there, based on your country. Also, you need qualified people as per national standards who will be involved in the data collection and data analyzing, so that the security of the data is ensured. Then the service team and national valuation experts should be involved. So how to look up at this data and how to analyze this data which has been collected from these surveys. Data processing, independent scrutiny, and possible legal action. And project orientation and training would be needed for the team. So you have to be sensitive enough to how to ask the questions when you're collecting any sort of socioeconomic data from the affected community. So that training should be given to the team who will be undertaking these surveys and who will be dealing with the data processing or analyzing. So these are some measures which were discussed for the data collection stage when we are doing surveys for land acquisition and resettlement. Some other measures are quality control measures to be adopted during surveying and data collection. So again, some level of quality should be maintained. Daily section of forms and input data required. So when this data was collecting, that date, who collected it, all of those information should be put in, so that anybody can recheck with that person again. Space should be formed to allow government and community witnesses to confirm that the survey process has been explained to the asset owners in their own language, and that their assets have been properly recorded. That is all of the information. There should be witnesses who can say that the survey process and the questions which were asked of them and the required documents which were scanned were done in the language in which the community was comfortable in. That is, they understood all of the things which were conveyed to them, and they were able to give the right answers. So this should be ensured, and there should be witnesses if possible, like community witnesses, not legal witnesses, but someone who maybe has undergone the same process and knows this is what was asked, so that all of this information can be cross-checked within the community members itself. Then the asset owner has been verified by appropriate ID. That is, this is their physical habitat. That is, the land which is being acquired is there, is, as the asset owner is saying, is theirs. So those documents need to be checked. Their appropriate ID or Aadhaar card numbers can be kept for reference. Then various specialist studies may be required to provide an in-depth understanding and recommendations for supporting the livelihood restoration planning. So if a community's livelihood gets affected, then for that you can have different in-depth studies. So again, displacement can be of two types. It can be a physical displacement, or it can be an economic displacement, where their livelihood or their financial the liability is affected. So in that case, another in-depth understanding or studies can be further taken depending on the nature of the land acquisition and the settlement schemes. So next, we also looked up at the development of the Resettlement Action Plan, or the RAP. So the components of a standard Resettlement Action Plan. So these are the sections which are included in your final EIA report. So you have the project description, you have potential impacts coming out of the land acquisition and resettlement phase. Then you have legal and institutional frameworks, which looks up at what was the compensation, with what all meetings were done. So all the national and regional, if legal documents or frameworks are there, they have been met, and they have been met according to whatever was stated in them. Then baseline studies which were conducted, the stakeholder engagement, that is all the stakeholders were made aware about the process, and they were aware of all of the pros and cons of the process in their own languages and all of these other nuances. Then the eligibility and valuation of losses and compensation entitlements. So based on the market value, the correct compensation was laid out to them and things like that. That has been checked. Then livelihood restoration, if they will find if their livelihood. Can you please unmute yourself? So if their livelihood was affected, then livelihood restoration techniques or measures, if anything was undertaken, that also needs to be reported in the resettlement action plan. Housing, infrastructure, and social services, they were also considered, and what all was undertaken within each of these sections. Then the organization of responsibility, which organization or which team was involved where, who did the socioeconomic survey, who did data analyzing, who did the mitigation and measurement, mitigation plans, and all of those things. Those needs to be stated, and who all was involved, what stakeholders were involved at which stages. All of these, this should be presented in a table or a chart format for easy understanding in your RAP or resettlement action plan. Then what was the schedule, what timeline was followed, at what stages the survey was undertaken, what was the data analyzing, what was the stakeholders interaction. So all of this schedule and timeline also needs to be included. What was the budget of the project, that is the land acquisition, including compensation, development, and all of that. What was the budget in terms of monetary values? Then what is the further monitoring, evaluation, and reporting framework? So these are the components of the standard resettlement action plan. If there are any specific project related things, then all those components can also be added based on where it will fit. But this is a standard RAP framework. For baseline studies, like we said, we have the census, we have survey data, we have the socioeconomic studies which the project team would have undertaken. Key people interviews, people of let's say if a village is being affected, then the panchayat has been interviewed. These key people have been interviewed relating to that community who is being affected because of the land acquisition. And focus group discussions where these are things which can be used for collecting the baseline data. Then we looked up at the extent of resettlement impact. So these depends on the magnitude of displacement, the characteristics of the project, the mitigation measures, and the characteristics of the community. Then we also looked up at typical social impacts which arise out of resettlement, because the community is directly involved. Then there are social impacts also, because this community is getting socially affected. Their social network is getting hampered because of the land acquisition. So those kind of social impacts also we looked up at. So some typical examples are when people's capabilities, abilities, and freedoms are affected to achieve their goals. Then community or social supports and political context might change, where this land acquired communities move to a new resettlement location. Then all of these dynamics can change. So you need to look up at all of these social impacts, the livelihood assets and activities, the access to culture and religion. So for example, if the land which was acquired had a very unique or a very that the members of that community worshipped a particular tree which was located in that land, then the access to culture and religion can identify that a similar kind of tree be planted in the new resettlement location and things like that. So access to culture and religion, access to infrastructure and services, housing and business structures, deterioration of land and natural resources, and poor living environment. So these are some social impacts which can arise from resettlement. Then we looked up at the compensation arrangements in the resettlement action plan. So the International Financial Corporation, or the IFC, recommends that projects prepare an entitlements matrix to identify one, the affected people. So these are entitled peoples whose property and land is being acquired. So landowners or property owners, tenants who were living there, squatterers who have been there for past couple of years, sharecroppers, grazers, nomadic pastoralists, and other natural resource users, vendors and other service providers, communities and vulnerable groups. So all of the people who have any sort of relationship with that land and have been using that land for the certain amount of period. Those are one class of people who are identified. Then the second impact could be all type of loss or impacts associated with each category, including loss of physical assets, loss of access to physical assets, loss of wages, rent or sales earning, loss of public infrastructure, and elements of cultural significance. So this is the second type of uh, category of people we identify. Then the types of compensation and assistance or entitlements to which each category of these people will be entitled. So you have two kinds of people: people who are one directly affected because of their land acquisition, and second whose financial or cultural interaction with that land is being affected. So based on that, the compensation is devised for each person. Then for the resettlement action plan, so how do you select the site for the resettlement? So based on the project procedure, this is the procedure. So you establish the resettlement site selection criteria, you do project design, land use mapping, present the preliminary options assessment, discuss it with the stakeholders, and if they agree, then we can move forward with the site for resettlement. So the last step was is the implementation and handover. So implementation and handover in the case of RAP is putting that the settlement action plan into action. The handover process completes the physical resettlement process. That is, if the land was acquired, the land has been cleared. That is, all of that land has been moved under the name of the project developer, and the people who were living on that land have been moved from that particular location to the new resettlement site which was selected. So this is the complete handover project when the physical resettlement process and the support for livelihood continues until restoration is achieved. The project has a responsibility also to assist a resettled community. So these are people who were initially landowners in the project developer's site. This community has become fully established in the new location. So they have to provide support and assistance in terms of getting them to settled in the new location. That is the last step. So we also looked about vulnerable or at-risk groups. So the definition for them is we have looked at this definition previously also. So people who, by virtue of gender, ethnicity, age, physical or mental disability, economic disadvantage, or social status, may be more diversely affected by displacement than others, and who may be limited in their ability to claim or take advantage of resettlement assistance and related development benefits. So people who are more likely to be who are at a certain disadvantage or a back foot compared to the rest or the average community user because of any of the above identified uh, parameters. Those are vulnerable or at-risk groups. Any sort of development or resettlement activity is going to be especially hard for these kind of people because they would have made their own patterns and daily activities or schedule for their particular location, but they have to make all of those patterns again at this new resettlement location. So it's going to be especially hard for them. So vulnerable or at-risk groups are looked at more sensitively in the land acquisition and resettlement process because it's going to be especially hard for them. So the until the handover and implementation, they have to be the project team has to make sure that they have been fully settled in that particular location. So the last step is monitoring and evaluation. So monitoring and evaluation components are performance monitoring, impact monitoring, and completion audit. So the key indicators which are used for monitoring and evaluation
Nidhi.
plan are hello are the payment of compensation. That is all of the compensation because the compensation might have been paid out in different phases or intervals. So all of this payment of compensation has been achieved, whether if there were any grievances which the displaced population felt after the compensation because of compensation issues or because of the new location issues, whether all of those grievances have been resolved between the two parties, that is the displaced population or the resettled population, as well as the project developer or the project developer team. Whether the community perceptions towards the project have been moved from negative to positive, and if there are any changes in household income, agriculture productivity, and employment. So those are key indicators on which monitoring and evaluation happens. So that was all which was discussed in lecture 51. So the second lecture in this week was lecture 52. Here we looked up at EIA methods for resource efficiency. So first we looked up at the definitions and concepts of resource efficiency. So resource efficiency, it can be measured in two parameters. So one is the measure of inputs and the second is measure of waste generated. So measure of inputs required in the proposed development at every phase, and measure of waste generated in the proposed development at every phase. So how much inputs are consumed and how much waste is generated because of consumption of those inputs. So examples are energy and water. These are the sources which go into the development of the project. So these are inputs as well, and there's going to be waste which is going to be generated out of their use. So that is resource efficiency. Then we also looked up at life cycle assessment. So there are two impacts we look up at. One is the upstream impacts. Upstream impacts are where and how the original materials are produced, processed, and manufactured, how they are packaged and transported, and how they are used. So those are upstream impacts. And downstream impacts. So these are upstream impacts are related to your inputs, how they are originally produced, how they are processed and manufactured, packaged, and transported and used. And downstream impacts are related to your waste generated, so how resulting wastes are managed at the site. So again, so a typical, we looked up at a typical product life cycle. So you have the materials which are used for the development. Then you have the processing or manufacturing. So at each stage, you will have certain materials being used and certain waste being generated out of it. Then packaging and transportation, their use and disposal. And if in disposal, you can reuse and recycle. All of this can be done again. So you move up again in this cycle. And then the materials which can be used are your any sort of physical material, energy, land, and water, and other things. So these are typical examples of how to what product life cycle can be used for calculating. Then we also looked up at the LCA, or the General Methodological Framework for Life Cycle Assessment. So this we have already looked up at. At every stage, you will have energy and you will have waste coming out of it. So you have material acquisition, your manufacture, manufacture, then use, consumption, and then final disposition. So for construction waste, usually you have construction any sort of waste. The final disposition can be in terms of landfill, combustion, reuse, or recycle. So again, if you're reusing or recycling, then this can go back a certain number of stages. And the life cycle assessment frame, for doing the life cycle assessment framework, we first look up at the goals and scope definition, the inventory analysis, and the impact assessment. At each stage, we look up at what this actually means and we interpret it. And it can be done for a number of applications. So during your product development and improvement, during strategic planning, public policy making, marketing, and other things, you can do a life cycle assessment. Then we looked up at energy and mass balance. So this is a concept for resource efficiency. So the sum of mass going into a system must equal to the sum of mass going out or being stored in that system. So similarly for energy, the sum of energy which goes into a system must be equal to the sum of energy going out of it, plus any changes in the composition of that system. So whatever is going in will also like come out in some form or the other, so that the balance is maintained. Then we also looked up at closed loop systems. So this is where a waste product can be used as a resource either in the same process or elsewhere. So resource efficiency increases. So because it forms a closed loop, that is towards the end, there's no a separate entity, like there's no disposal or anything, but you reuse or recycle that. So it forms a closed loop in that project cycle or the product cycle. So we then looked up at waste hierarchy. So waste hierarchy goes like reducing the amount of waste which is being produced. If and you go each step further if you are able to. Then reusing of materials if you are able to reuse them. Recycling of materials into new products, recovery of energy from waste, and landfill of any remaining waste. So if you're able to reduce, reuse, recycle, and recover, then it's good. If you can't, then the waste material then goes into the landfill. So this is the hierarchy. Then we also looked about the concept of self-sufficiency and resilience. So it allows more outputs to be achieved from a given amount of inputs. That is, you optimize your project development and all of these cycles so that you get more output out of the limited resources that you have. Okay, so in terms of housing, energy, and food, and all of these things, you can apply the concept of self sufficiency and resilience. So when we do the scoping and baseline studies, we look up at questions like will construction or operation of the project use natural resources? So here we are looking up at natural resources. So these are your inputs such as land, water, material, or energy, especially any resource which are non-renewable or are in short supply. So first we identify what are the inputs or what are the resources which we are using. So like land, water, minerals, aggregates, forests, energy, what forms of energy, or any other resources. You first identify all of those inputs. Then you look up at how will the project produce solid waste during construction or operation or decommissioning. So what kind of waste will be generated out of using of these inputs or materials. So this is in terms of different because at different stages you will have different materials which are being used, so different inputs and different ways which are going to be generated. So then you look up at all of these to get a better understanding of what is coming in and what is going out. So, in terms of impact prediction, then we look up at impact prediction and evaluation based on what resources was used and what waste was generated. So, if we are looking up at materials, so especially in a development project, it's like construction materials or water or any sort of those things. So, we look up at the quantity of materials or resources which were consumed, where the materials or resources will come from, what is their source. So, if it's water, then is it your natural water pipelines or is it from tankers or other things? So where these materials or resources are coming from, whether there will be significant impacts at any material donor site, for instance, burrow pits for aggregates. So you look up at where they are coming, what in what form they are coming. So you analyze that entire life cycle of that material. Then for land, you have similar what is the quantity of undeveloped or previously developed land required, whether land is scarce in that region, what other alternative land can be used, and things like that. Similarly, for energy, what quantity of energy is being used, uh, the what if there's embodied, if we also consider the embodied energy in the projects. Embodied energy is when a product, because it has been certain energy has been used in the manufacturing of that product. So that is the embodied energy. So that is also considered for the different construction materials and things like that. So what is the energy which is going in into your project and what is coming out? Okay. Similarly, for other resources, water, waste, all of this is looked up at. Then we look up at mitigation measures. So in mitigation measures, you should indicate or include the reuse of waste materials where possible. So it gives a plus point to your project that whatever waste you are generating, you're trying to reuse that waste into your project. So, for example, water from your gray water, that is water from your showers and things, after certain treatment, it can be used for landscaping. So this helps in giving a framework that waste which is being generated at site can be used again for a different project purpose only. So the use of materials wherever possible, locating resource requirements close to production site, that is where you are sourcing your original material, that transportation cost or that carbon emissions can be reduced for that because of transportation for that material. Then waste hierarchy can be applied. So the hierarchy which we looked up at reducing, recycling, reusing, and all of those that is being followed. So these are mitigation measures which can be used for establishing resource efficiency. So certain indicators which are used for resource efficiency. So we have three types of indicators. So first indicator measures the progress in productivity of the use of resources. So in terms of let's say rupee per kg or euro per kg. Indicators to evaluate the environmental impact of the use of specific resources. So impact per kg, that is this much carbon emissions per kg of material which was used. And the third indicator is to measure progress in reducing the ecological stress of resource or the eco efficiency. So the cost associated benefit of uh, cost associated benefit per impact, that is this much reduction in climate change and things like that. So these three categories or three types of indicators can be used for measuring resource efficiency. Then we also looked up at these categories based on the environmental impacts, resource use, and socioeconomic benefits. So these are things which are related with resource specific impacts, resource productivity, and eco-efficiency. So we have discussed this in the previous slide as well. So the next lecture was lecture 53. So this was EIA methods for risk and risk assessment. So first we started looking at definitions and concepts. So risk is an outcome of hazard or hazardous events. Hazard is an inherent property of an object to create damage to humans or the environment. And these objects can be inherently dangerous, and exposure to them can cause injury, health problems, or loss of environmental quality. Okay. Then hazards again can be of two types. So they can be long-term exposure at low levels or short-term exposure at high levels. We also looked up at chronic hazards. So this is when objects can cause harm to humans by extended exposure, but at relatively low levels. The second is natural hazards. So things like fertilizers can cause ecological damage and end up in wetlands and cause algal blooms or eutrophication. So when any environmental parameters being affected, those are natural hazards. Then hazardous events where humans or other species are exposed to a hazard at high levels and harm to humans or environment occur very quickly. So an example of this is the Bhopal gas tragedy, which was when that the natural gas is transported because of the leakage of the natural gas. The Bhopal gas tragedy happened. So this was the exposure of natural gas to humans at high levels. So that resulted in casualties and death. So this is an example of a hazardous event. We also looked up at risk in terms of frequency and consequences. So this is the product of frequency and consequences. So concerns relating to this can be individual concerns. So it can relate to individuals' perception of risk from a particular hazard and how it affects them directly and how it affects the things they personally value. Whereas the second concern can be societal concern. So it's a broad concept which relates to those hazards that impact on society rather than an individual and is usually associated with an accident or an event that leads to significant and widespread impacts causing multiple fatalities or injuries. So two type of concerns. We also looked up at framework for tolerability of risks. So down below we have broadly acceptable region. So this is a fairly, if your risks from any sort of development or things fall in this region, it's broadly acceptable. Whereas this is the tolerable region. So risk is taken only if a benefit is required. And this is the unacceptable region. That is, no amount of risk can be justified to be taken in this region. Okay, except in extraordinary circumstances. So this is the hierarchy. And for doing risk assessment or risk management framework, we first identify the hazards. So these are the things that can go wrong in any sort of in your project development. Then you identify the consequences. That is, if things go wrong and the hazard is realized, these are going to be the consequences coming out of these hazards. Then you determine the likelihood that things will go wrong. That there's, let's say, there's a 50% chance of this thing to happen. So you include the nature and extent of those uncertainties. So you put this much is the chance, this is the percentage, or uh, these many people might be affected. Out of 1 in 4 people might be affected. So things like that you mention in terms of figures and numbers, and you establish the acceptability of the risk level compared to the acceptability criteria. And then you use this for decision making. That is, your proposal may be required to reduce the risk further if risk is unacceptable or if refused. So you then look up at this risk hierarchy framework and see where your risk falls and if it can be reduced because of any sort of mitigation measures. So you give all of those and in your risk management framework. And then you also give a section for ongoing control. That is the monitoring frameworks, control systems that you might need to put in place to control this risk and further reduce it. So this is the general framework. Here we have the mitigation hierarchy. So again, reduce, if the risk is too high, then the proposal will need to be modified to reduce the risk to acceptable levels. That is that hierarchy. So you need to reduce it as much as you can. If possible, you should avoid it. That is, if the risk is too high, and then an alternative location could be considered for the industry, or no sensitive land uses could be permitted within the tolerable or unacceptable risk contours. This is a general framework of the quantitative risk assessment. So you first start, you identify your risk areas, you select any one risk area and identify what are going to be the consequences or the failure cases. uh, you identify, so if in a risk area you have multiple failure cases, that is multiple things can go wrong, then you identify all of those, then you identify the consequences out of each of these. If this thing happens, then what are going to be the consequences? You give them the numbers, the frequency and estimates. You record all of this in a summary, and you see whether all of the consequences coming out of that individual failure case has been studied or not. If not, you include all of those again. You like include the ones which have been missing, and then you do it for all of the risk areas which were identified, and then you see whether these risks fall into tolerable categories or not, and what and where can be reduced. The risk can be reduced and things like that. So that was for this management. Then lecture 54 was for AIA methods on cumulative effects. So then we first begin with definition and concepts. So cumulative impacts, as the definition given by USCEQ in 1997, are impacts on the environment which results from the incremental impact of the action when added to other past, present, and reasonable foreseeable future actions. So and Another definition is impacts that result from incremental changes caused by other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future actions together with the project. We also looked up at the IFC's definition, or International Finance Corporation's definition. So, cumulative impacts are those that arise from the successive, incremental, and/or combined effects of an action, project, or activity when added to other existing, planned, and/or reasonably anticipated future ones. So those were the basic definition for cumulative effects itself. Then we looked up at additive effects. So this is the sum of magnitude of the same effect. So for example, noise and noise. So if you have two sources of noise, then those can be combined together. So their magnitudes are added. That is, if there was a 20 decibel noise and a 10 decibel noise, so you have a total 30 decibel noise, which the listener is now listening at that point. And the combined effect is assessed as if resulting from a single project. So it was from two sources, but we show it as one source. So that is clubbing. So this is additive effects if they can be added together. Then synergistic effects are difficult to recognize and complex to assess as they arise from the combination of different effects. So things like noise and visual, or noise and vibration. Let's say, for example, using uh, uh, something which generates noise and vibration. So you have two different types of effects which are coming. So you can't basically club them and say that this is they are together, but you are feeling two different effects at the same point. So as the effects can be intra, that is occurring within one project, program, or plan, as well as inter, that is occurring from different projects, programs, or plans. So these are synergistic effects. They are different nature of effects which are felt together. Okay. Then we looked up at intra-project effects. So intra-projects which are occurring within the uh, same project. So effects occur between different environmental topics or parameters within the same proposal as a result of that development's direct effects, whereas inter-project effects are because of two different projects. You are getting an impact. So this form, inter-project effects, this form of cumulative effects occur as a result of the likely impacts of the proposed development interacting with the impacts of other developments in the vicinity. Okay. So then we also looked about indirect impacts. So impacts on the environment which are not a direct result of the project, often produced away from or as a result of complex pathways. So sometimes they are referred as second or direct level impacts or secondary impacts. So because of your development, you're getting some impact, but you are also generating an indirect impact on somebody else. So These are the indirect impacts. Then cumulative impacts, as we have seen, different incremental changes caused by other past, present, or reasonably foreseeable actions together with the project. So two impacts which can be clubbed together so that they are felt either higher in magnitude, like additive impacts, or two different kind of impacts, like synergistic effects. Okay. Then we looked up at impact interaction. So the reactions between impacts, whether between the impacts of just one project or between the impacts of other projects in the area. So if there are two developments, you have two different impacts. So they can interact and lead to a new kind of impact, like uh, you'll have the same nature, but it can lead to more higher irritation value or something like that. So those are impact interactions. Then valued ecosystem components, so environmental features that may be affected by a project and that have been identified to be of concern by the proponent, government agencies, Aboriginal people, or the public. So those were the definitions. Then we look up at the difference between environmental impact assessment and cumulative impact assessment. So both of them have the same logical framework and analytical processes and tools, but they are from different perspectives. EIA is more project centric, whereas your cumulative impacts can assess impacts from other projects also which are happening at the same time. So any nearby development, if it's happening, it will club those cumulative impacts, because at the end of the day, you have the community outside, because at the same time, two development projects are happening. They are going to still face, they might be more highly irritatable because of the two projects which are happening together. So you need to consider or manage your timeline such that these impacts are minimized so that the community is not getting directly affected, or the environment is not getting directly affected because of all of these things. Okay. So the components which we look up in cumulative impact assessment. So first we have the anticipated future condition. That is, what is the total effect of the other existing and the predictable future developments and external natural environment and social drivers, and the contribution of development under evaluation to the cumulative impacts. Then for scoping and baseline, we have the cumulative effects assessment, CEA, or cumulative impact assessment, CIA, or cumulative effects assessment and management, CEAM. So these have been discussed in the lecture in detail, what each of these terms mean. So, and when we use what term. So, this is basically a systematic procedure for identifying and evaluating the significance of the effects from multiple activities within the framework of the EIA process. And the purpose for which we do a cumulative impact assessment is to consider the incremental contribution of the project together with effects from other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future activities. Okay. So for doing the prediction and evaluation, you look up, you have different techniques and things. Again, this has been discussed. So different impact identification techniques can be used, like checklists and consultation questionnaires, network and analysis, spatial analysis, matrices, expert opinion, modeling if there are more things, and other kind of things. So this have again been discussed. Then we also looked up at the proximate cause test of significance in the prediction and evaluation for cumulative effects. So this is a three-phase procedure for performing cumulative effect assessment. So first you determine whether a proposal would proximately cause a significant effect on a given resource. Then you investigate how the affected environment has reached its current condition and the projected trajectory as a result of the aggregated effects of the past action, and you define an appropriate spatial and temporal scale for the impact assessment. And the third is determining, which is what happens to that condition and trend of that resource if no action is taken, including effects of other present or reasonably foreseeable future actions, and what happens to this maintained or altered trend if the proposed or alternative actions are taken. So you show both the cases where if no action is taken, how this will skyrocket, and you also give if you take certain actions, that is the mitigation steps which you are saying, how that trajectory will be affected. Okay. So mitigation, these measures can include like reducing construction and operational aspects of development, provision of measures to manage the effects, and restricting the extent of the proposed development. So how you minimize all of the cumulative effects which you feel are going to be felt at your because of your development project. Then for hierarchy, we looked up at hierarchy of mitigation of increasing complexity, effort, and coordination for cumulative effects. So it is important that you have an information exchange, that is, you undergo and see if there are other development activities which are happening. What is the scenario? Not just development activities, but the kind of land use and things which are in your site and how your construction activities can affect them, pooling of resources, and doing proactive management of timing and location of the developments. So, after doing all of that information collection, how you're going to do your project management and how at what timeline you're going to do what activities based on what is the proposed timeline for the nearby development, so that you don't lead to a higher magnitude of cumulative effects. Okay, then the last lecture for this week was the EIA environmental management plans. So the environmental management plan or EMP, these are measures to be undertaken during the implementation and operation of a project to eliminate or offset adverse environmental effects, impacts, or to reduce them to acceptable levels. So the actions which are needed to implement these measures, the EMP is an integral part of a category A EAS, irrespective of other instruments used. So this is the definition by the World Bank. The aim of doing it or making environmental management plans is to provide an essential link between the impacts predicted and mitigation measures which are specified within the EIA reports and their implementation and operational activities. Then we have certain key legislation, policies, and guidelines from both international and national levels. So these are the guidances which are available for doing environmental management plans. So for different, we have specific like for UK we have for design manuals for roads and bridges. So for different uh, countries we have different guidances and legislations which we need to follow. You have another best practice series by the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, IEMA. You have the environmental management plans. Then the outline methodology and environmental study management plan structure. So you have the contractual agreement, competent environmental professionals, collaboration with stakeholders engagement, the distribution of roles and responsibilities, identification of key documents or references, the procedure and approach to non-compliance. So this is the recommended structure for the environment management plan. So this is how this comes in your EIA report as well. So first you mention the cover, that is the if there are any changes or what version of this document has been done, what date this is being used. This is done so that the track keeping or number keeping of the authority is there or the organization is there. The main components which are relevant to us is first is the you have the contents page, then you have the executive summary. So here you list in briefly what were the key issues and what were the findings. Then you have introduction where you give the summary of the project, the environment parameters which are outside, which are in your project vicinity and things. Then there's a project summary where you list all of the project related information. So what is the location, site, layout plans, the different project phases, the construction activities which were planned at what timeline, what was the employment numbers, labor forces which were involved, at what stages they were involved, what was the infrastructure which was developed because of the project or for the project, and what was the schedule. So you list all of that. This is the key information which is given here. Then you have summary of effects. So you identify all the positive and negative effects which are associated with each of the project stages that require management actions. So any negative, if it can be turned into positive, or the things like that you mentioned, you give a summary. Uh, you have the methodology which was included, what were the limitations which were identified, what policies and guidances was followed, and what were the national or legal legislature things. What was the project team composition and their responsibilities. So if you have more than one organizations, what were their roles, at what stages they were involved, what was the timeline and things. This is all recorded. Okay. And then what was the cost estimates or budgets for the implementation? Then environmental and socially significant changes. So all of these specific things are mentioned. If there were any site-specific environmental and social actions which were undertaken, so any sort of land acquisition, resettlement things can be mentioned here, and their processes and further things. Any sort of if grievances mechanism or consultation requirements was done, all of that, where there were non-compliance and management reviews, all of this is included. Then references and affordances, so surveys and methodology things which were considered, all of that is attached in the appendix as a supplementary material to support your environmental management plan. Okay. So this was all which we discussed in lecture 55 and throughout week 11. So if you have any questions, you can either put them in the chat box or just unmute and ask before we go into the next session where we do question and answers for the from the previous one of the course. Okay, so if there are no queries, let's go into question and answers. So I'm going to ask you questions based on this week's content, and you can put your answers in the chat box. Okay, so just open the chat box. Okay, so the first question is match the project influence zones in the context of EIA given in group 1 with the description in group 2. So these are zones relating to the land acquisition and resettlement. So we had the primary zone and the secondary zone, and what is the definitions? So you need to match group 1, the terms with their definitions in group 2. This is from lecture 51, land acquisition, AIA methods for land acquisition, resettlement. Okay. So the correct answer is A, that is a primary zone is the zone of direct impact areas. So these are areas where the project activities and facilities are located, including your access routes, water and power supply network, supply chains, and employee accommodation. So P matches with 1. Then your secondary zone is the larger region in which the project is located, and that will encounter the main economic impacts on the project, including the influx of economic migrants as well as employment and business opportunities. So Q matches with 2. Okay, so the correct answer is A, that is P matches with 1 and Q matches with 2. Okay, so the next question is match the components of a standard resettlement action plan, RAP, given in group 1 with their description in group 2. So in group 1, we have the different components which are used in the standard resettlement action plan. And in group 2, we have their description. So we need to match group 1 with group 2. Okay, so the correct answer is D, that is livelihood restoration are measures to improve and restore the livelihood of displaced people. So P matches with 4. Then schedule is covering all resettlement activities from preparation to implementation and how resettlement is linked to the implementation of the overall project. So Q matches with 1. Then baseline studies, that's a summary of studies undertaken, including census, surveys, socioeconomic studies, key people interview, focus groups, etc. So R matches with 2. and the eligibility and valuation of losses and compensation entitlements. So this is the methodology which is used to value the losses under local laws and supplementary measures needed to achieve full replacement costs. So S matches with 3. So the correct answer is D, that is P matches with 4, Q matches with 1, R matches with 2, and S matches with 3. Okay. So moving on to the next question. The extent of the settlement impacts depend on the following: one, magnitude of the displacement; two, characteristics of the project and its mitigation measures; three, characteristics of the community; and four, all of the above. So, which of these statements is true? That is one and two only, one and three only, two and three only, or four. Okay, we have one answer D. So D is the correct answer. That is all of the four. That is all of the above is the correct answer. So the extent of resettlement impacts, it depends on the magnitude of displacement. So one is correct. Characteristics of the project and its mitigation measures. So two is correct. And lastly, the characteristics of the community. So four, all of the above is the correct answer. Hence D is our correct answer. Okay. So moving on to the next question. So match the following terms given in group A with their description in group B. So we have the definitions relating to the module on resource efficiency, that is the IA methods for resource efficiency. So we have resource efficiency, closed loop systems, energy balance, and mass balance, and their definitions. We need to match them. We have one answer. Okay, we have another answer. Okay, so the correct answer is C, that is the source efficiency is the measure of the inputs and waste generated in the proposed development at each phase. So P matches with 2. Then closed loop systems is where a waste product can be used as a resource either in the same process or elsewhere. So Q matches with 1. Then energy balance is the sum of energy going into a system must be equal to the sum of energy going out of it plus any changes in the composition of that system. And so R matches with 4. And mass balance is the sum of mass going into a system must equal to the sum of mass going out or being stored in that system. So S matches with 3. So the correct answer is C, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 1, R matches with 4, and S matches with 3. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Select the correct order as per the waste hierarchy. So we start from the beginning, and the last one is the last option, the last thing that we need to do in the waste hierarchy. So we have reduce, reuse, recycle, recover, and landfill. So what is the correct order? Okay, so the correct answer is A. So we have first the reduction of the amount of waste produced. Then we have the use of materials. So first we try to reduce any waste which is being produced. So we try to increase the efficiency of the resource or inputs we are using. Then we have the use of materials. Then we have recycling of materials into new products. The fourth step is recovering of energy from waste. And the last thing that we do in waste hierarchy is landfill of any remaining waste. Okay. So this is how we reduce, do go about with the waste hierarchy. So A is the correct answer. So moving on to the next question. So match the following terms given in group A with their description in group B. So these are terms and definitions from the EIA methods for risk management and assessment. So we have terms like risk, hazard, chronic hazard, and hazardous events. Okay, so again, definitions, because we looked up a lot of definitions in this so far in this week as well. Definitions again are very important, and these can literally translate to these kind of questions in your exam. So look up at all the definitions so far. Okay, we have one answer. Okay, so the correct answer is D. That is, risk is the outcome of hazards or hazardous events. So P matches with 4. Then hazard is the inherent property of an object to create damage to humans or the environment. So Q matches with 3. Then chronic hazards are hazards that cause harm over a period of time through long-term exposure, typically include toxic chemicals and or low-level radioactive materials. So R matches with 2. Then hazardous event is an event where humans or other species are exposed to a hazard at high levels and harm to humans or the environment occurs very quickly. So an example of hazardous event is the Bhopal gas tragedy. So S matches with 1. Okay, so the correct answer is D, that is P matches with 4, Q matches with 3, R matches with 2, and S matches with 1. Okay, so moving on to the next question. The process of evaluating and assigning a numerical value to the risk associated with an industry, which also includes the practices of probabilistic safety assessments and probabilistic risk assessment, risk analysis, PRA, is called A, quantitative risk assessment, or B, qualitative risk assessment. Okay, we have one answer A. Okay, we have another answer A. So A is the correct answer. So because the definition itself is speaking of numbers, that is, you're directly assigning numerical value to the risk associated. And you're also looking at the practices of probability and probabilistic risk analysis. So these are all numerical or quantitative assessments. So this is quantitative risk assessment. Okay, so A is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. The region between lower tolerable limit and upper tolerable limit, that is the skin between the two values, is known as. So the X region which is marked, what is that region? Okay, we have one answer A. Okay, so the correct answer is A, that is ALAP region. So this is the region between the lower tolerable limit and the upper tolerable limit. So this is the tolerable region, also known as ALAP. So ALAP is as low as relatively possible. So that is why the acronym, that is as low as relatively possible. So we only take risk in this region if there's a benefit required. Otherwise, we try to remain in this broadly acceptable region only. Okay, so A is the correct answer. So moving on to the next question. Match the following terms of group A with their description in group B. So in group A, we have two types of effects, that is additive cumulative effect and synergistic cumulative effect. So, and in group B, we have their examples. So you need to match group A with group B. Okay, we have one answer B. Okay, so the correct answer is B. So we have additive effects. P, which matches with 2, that is noise and noise. So this is the sum of magnitudes of the same effect. So noise from two different sources has been combined together to have a larger single impact. So that is why the term additive, because these can be added together. So P is noise and noise, that is P matches with 2. And then synergistic effects are difficult to recognize and complex because they are the combination of two different effects which are acting together. So an example of this is noise and visual. So these are two different kind of impacts and they can't be clubbed together, but they are they are occurring together. So this is an example of synergistic effect. So Q matches with 1. So the correct answer is B, that is P matches with 2 and Q matches with 1. Okay. So moving on to the next question. The proximate cost test of significance for effect prediction for performing a defensible cumulative effect assessment, CEA, includes the following. A. Determining whether the proposal would proximately cause a significant effect on a given resource. B. Investigating how the affected environment has reached its current conditions and projected trajectory as a result of aggregate effects of past actions, defining an appropriate spatial and temporal scale for the impact assessment. C. Determining what happens to the condition and trend of this resource if no action is taken, including effects of other present and reasonably foreseeable future actions. And what happens to this maintained or altered trend if the proposed or alternative actions are taken. Or D. All of the above. We have an answer D. Okay, so D is the correct answer. So the proximate cost test for testing the significance for effect prediction for when we are doing the cumulative impact assessment, it includes first determining whether they're going to be whether there are cumulative effects on any of the given resources. So A is correct. Then B is whether this is an effect of you investigate what past actions are being added or aggregate effect of past actions. This is happening. So B is also correct. And then C is determining what happens if this condition and trend goes on if no action is taken. And what happens if there's an action or mitigation measure is taken? What is the trend or what is the altered trend which we will see? So C is also correct. So D, all of the above is correct. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Match the following terms of Group A with their description given in Group B. So we have definitions from the module on EIE methods for cumulative impacts and their definitions in Group B. So you need to match Group A with Group B. So we have seen a lot of questions from this module coming out from just definitions. So again, make a note to revise them so close to the examination. Okay, we have an answer B. Okay, so the correct answer is B. Cumulative impacts are impacts that arise from successive, incremental, and/or combined effects of an action, project, or activity when added to other existing, planned, or and/or reasonably anticipated future ones. So P matches with 2. Then valued components are environmental features that may be affected by a project and that have been identified to be of concern by the proponent, government agencies, Aboriginal people, or the public. So Q matches with 3. Then indirect impacts are impacts on the environment which are not a direct result of the project. They are often produced away from or as a result of a complex pathway. So R matches with 4. And then impact interactions are the reactions between impacts, whether between the impacts of just one project or between the impacts of other projects in the area. So S matches with 1. So the correct answer is B, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, R matches with 4, and S matches with 1. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Which of the documents sets out the actions needed to manage environmental and social effects associated with the construction and operation of a development? Is it A, Environmental and Social Management Plans, ESMPs, B, Environmental Impact Assessment, EIA, C, Scoping Reports, and D, Baseline Assessment Report? So we are looking at both environmental and social effects which are associated with the construction and operation of a development. So we have an answer A. So A is the correct answer. This is the definition for the environmental and social management plans or ASMPs, because we are looking up at both the environmental and social effects and we are associating them with the construction and operation of the development. Okay. So, moving on to the next question. The key principles for successful environmental and social management plans (ESMPs) includes the following: one, contractual agreement; two, cost of the mitigation actions and implementation of ESMP; three, involvement of competent environmental professionals; and four, identification of key documents or references. So, which of the one, two, four are correct? Okay, we have one answer D. So D is the correct answer. So all the four options which are mentioned, they are correct and uh, included in the key principles for successful ESMPs. So we have the contractual agreement, the cost of mitigation actions and implementation of the environmental and social management plan, the involvement of competent environmental professionals, and the identification of key documents and references. So D, 1, 2, 3, 4 is the correct answer. So, moving on to the next question. Identify the challenges in using environmental and social management plans. One, need for environmental management responsiveness. Two, system to manage environmental impacts with careful monitoring of contract requirements. Three, periodic evaluation of environmental performance measures. And four, all of the above. Okay, we have an answer D. So D is the correct answer. That is all of the three options which are mentioned. That is need for environmental management responsiveness, the system to manage environmental impacts with careful monitoring of contract requirements, and the periodic evaluation of environment performance measures. So for all of the above is the correct answer. Hence D is the correct option. So moving on to the next question. Environmental management plans (EMPs) are listed in the World Bank's Operation Procedure 4.01 as an instrument for compliance with the bank's environmental assessment requirements. Is this statement true or false? We have answer A. Okay, so A is the correct answer. So in Operational Procedure 4.01 of World Bank, we have they have mentioned the environmental management plans or EMPs as an instrument for compliance with the World Bank's environmental assessment requirements. So A, true, is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. Which options among the given option is a component of the monitoring and evaluation of resettlement action plan? A, performance monitoring; B, impact monitoring; C, completion audit; or D, all of the above? Okay, so D. So D is the correct answer. That is, all of the three options are components of the monitoring and evaluation for the resettlement action plan. So this is performance monitoring, impact monitoring, and completion monitoring. Hence, all of the above is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. State true or false. Indigenous people are one of the associated ESS, environmental and social standards, as per AIIB's ESP of 2021. This was a question which was in last year's assignment. So the correct answer is A, true. So in this particular organization's ESP, indigenous people are one of the associated. Uh, so ESS 3 looks up at indigenous people, so looks up at both the environmental and social standards. Okay. So moving on to the next question. As per the life cycle assessment, resultant waste from process is considered under which impact category? Is it A, upstream impacts, or B, downstream impacts? So question from the module on resource efficiency. Okay, we have an answer B. So B is the correct answer. So upstream is anything which is related to inputs or materials and how they are being produced, processed, and manufactured, packaged, transported, and used. Whereas downstreams is how the resulting waste is managed. So the resultant waste from the process is considered under downstream impacts in the life cycle assessment. So B is the correct answer. So, moving on to the next question. As per the Life Cycle Assessment Handbook, a guide for environmentally sustainable products, choose the correct option for the blue box to complete the general methodology framework for life cycle assessment. So, does the blue box indicate A, impact assessment, B, embodied energy calculation, C, operational energy calculation, or D, greenhouse gas emission assessment? So from figures also you can get questions like in hierarchies and things, you can get questions like these. Okay, we have an answer A. So A is the correct answer. So impact assessment. So it's goal and scope definition, inventory analysis, and impact assessment, and the interpretation at each of these stages. So A is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. Identify the most comprehensive framework for life cycle assessment amongst the following. Is it A, cradle to gate, B, cradle to site, C, cradle to use, or D, cradle to grave? Okay, so we have an answer D. So this was discussed in the lecture unit as well. So the correct answer is D, that is cradle to grave. So, cradle to grave is the most comprehensive or extensive framework for life cycle assessment. So, it includes all of the product stage, construction process, use stage, and the end of life stage. Okay, so D is the correct answer. So, moving on to the next question. Which among the following options is represented in a water balance diagram? A, water used for cooling tower. B, the solid waste generated on site. C, plastics disposed of on the site. Or D, noise generated during construction. This is again based on a example which was discussed based on a figure. Okay, we have an answer A. So A is the correct answer. So because none of the other options have any sort of water balance requirement. So for a water balance diagram can be used to represent the water used for cooling tower. So A is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. State true or false. The risk management framework is a component of EIA. Is the statement A true or B false? Okay, we have one answer A. So the statement is true. The risk management framework is a component of EIA if there are any risks or hazards associated with the development of that project. So the risk management framework is then used. So the statement is true. Moving on to the next question. So which of the following is an example of a chronic hazard? A, prolonged exposure to radioactive material. B, risk of falling objects. C, risk of accidental injury. Or D, risk of a natural hazard such as a landslide. Okay, we have an answer A. So A is the correct answer. So chronic hazards are where the objects cause harms to human by extended exposure but at relatively low levels. So this is long exposure but at low levels. So radioactive materials, when there's prolonged exposure to them, can be a chronic hazard. So A is the correct answer. Okay, so next question. Bhopal Union Carbide accident is an example of which kind of hazard? A, natural hazard, B, acute hazard, C, biological hazard, or D, ergonomic hazard? Okay, we have an answer B. Okay, so B is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. In the context of AIA, CI stands for what? A, cumulative impact assessment, B, cumulative industrial assessment, C, comparative indicator assessment, or D, central investigation agency. Okay, so full forms again are questions which can be asked. So we have one answer A. So A is the correct answer. CIA stands for Cumulative Impact Assessment. So moving on, arrange the following methodological steps in their correct order as per cumulative effect assessment. One, prediction and evaluation. Two, scoping and baseline. And three, mitigation. So what is the correct order in which we do cumulative effects assessment? Here we have an answer C. So C is the correct answer. First, we do scoping and baseline. So two is the first step. Then we do prediction and evaluation of the cumulative effects. So that is one is the second step. And the last step is mitigation of these effects. So three is the last step. So it's two, one, and three. That is scoping and baseline, prediction and evaluation, and mitigation. So C is the correct answer. Okay, so moving on, match the definitions from group B with their correct headings from group A. So again, the definitions and terms. So we have cumulative effects, additive effects, and synergistic effects. Okay, so the correct answer is C, that is cumulative effects, as the effects arising from the successive incremental and or combined effects of an action. So P matches with 3. Then additive effects are the sum of magnitudes of the same effect. So Q matches with 1. An example of this was noise and noise, which we looked at. Then we have synergistic effects, which are combination of different effects. So noise and visual was an example of this. So R matches with 2. So the correct answer is C, that is P matches with 3, Q matches with 1, R matches with 2. Okay. So moving on, match the legislation from Group A with the countries of origin from Group B. So these are again some legislations which were discussed in the environmental management plans. So for what country, what legislation is there? Okay, so the correct answer is C. That is for Hong Kong, we have the Environmental Impact Assessment Ordinance, CAP 499. So P matches with 3. For South Africa, we have the National Environmental Management Act, Act number 107 of 1998. So Q matches with 1. And then for India, we have the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. So R matches with 2. Okay, so C is the correct answer. That is P matches with 3, Q matches with 1, and R matches with 2. Okay, so this was all the questions. So if you have any queries, you can either put them in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask. Okay, what is an economic hazard? So anything which comes out of something which leads to some sort of deformation or affects the general body ergonomics is like an ergonomic hazard. So yeah, I mean that's the basic definition. Was it not discussed in the lecture unit? So anything which was discussed in details in the actual recordings of Lakra ma'am, Those are the only kind of questions which can come. But just a general definition is this anything which cause like any sort of deformation in. So ergonomics is basically relating to the comfort of the human body. So anything which causes any sort of deformation or harm to the body composition. So those kind of uh, hazards are known as ergonomic hazards. Okay. Is there any other question? Okay. Okay. Since we did not receive any queries from you in the discussion forums, uh, we don't have any queries. So on that note, thank you so much for attending this session. And if you have any feedback, you can give them in the feedback forms which are circulated to you, or you can give them now as well. And the recording for the session will be put as a YouTube link, and you can access this from the problem solving sessions tab in your NPTEL window. And the slides will be updated in the same folder. In the same Excel sheet, you'll find the recording link as well as the slides data. So thank you so much for attending this session. And I think I can now close this meeting. Thank you.